On a chilly spring morning in the Aegean Sea, a motley collection of ships churned across the Dardanelles. A wind from the north frothed the tops of the deep blue waves. The sailors at work sent salty ocean water spraying into the gray morning air. They were heading just a few miles between two rocky coastlines. On one side was Europe, on the other was Asia. This was an old crossroads for mythic heroes and merchants alike. These waters saw the struggles of Achilles and Odysseus. They carried the Persians on their way to attack the Greeks in the 5th century BC. They watched Alexander the Great trace that same path in the opposite direction later. The great city of Constantinople grew up just a short distance away on the shores of all of this heroic history. It was here in 1352 that an army waited. On the southern side of the Dardanelles, impatient horses pawed the ground and whinnied under the weight of their riders. These were Turkomans, independent-minded raiders, hired by Orhan, the son of Osman, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. They were heavily armed. Their swords, steel helmets, and chainmail armor clanked and rustled with each small shift. They told each other stories. They bragged about the plunder they would take, and they soothed their horses as they watched the ships from the north grow larger on the horizon. Back on board the creaking ships, Greek sailors flying the colors of the Byzantine Emperor John VI Kantakouzenos prepared to dock. They would carry the Turkomans to the European side, ready for Orhan's call in case of a war. The fortress they were being taken to defend was small and largely unimportant. But big things often grow from such humble beginnings. As they boarded the ships, the Turkomans didn't know what was waiting for them on the other side. They didn't know it yet, but they would soon take Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and eventually Constantinople itself. Their armies would eventually ravage Hungary and besiege Vienna. They would raid the outskirts of Venice and light fires visible for miles. After these Turkomans stepped foot on European soil in 1352, the Ottomans would never again leave. The world would never be the same. Hi, everybody. From Wondery, I'm Patrick Wyman. Welcome to another episode of Tides of History. Thanks for joining me. Long before it fractured in the aftermath of the First World War, long before it became the sick man of Europe in the 19th century, long before the Sultan and his palace came to symbolize all that was decadent and other about the Islamic world, before all of that, the Ottoman Empire towered over early modern Europe and the Middle East. Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan from 1520 to 1566, was the dominant ruler of his time. The centralized state that he and his predecessors had built was the gold standard in an era of other accomplished state builders. Suleiman's enormous, disciplined, technologically advanced armies incited fear from the gates of Vienna to Tabriz and everywhere in between. At its peak, Suleiman's territory seemed boundless. It was only halted by geographic barriers. Ottoman lands touched the Persian Gulf in the east and the Straits of Gibraltar in the west, the Red Sea in the south, and the Crimean Peninsula in the north. When we strip away the centuries of decline before the painful end in the 20th century, we see an enormously powerful, cutting-edge state. More than anything else, we see a European power. The Ottomans first landed in Europe in 1352, settling the territorial heart of the empire around the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the Turkish straits that formed the continental boundary between Europe and Asia. The early, rich Ottoman pickings were in the Balkans, what's now Greece, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Bosnia, and Serbia. That would become the Ottoman heartland for centuries to come. I'm spending some time on geography here because if we want to understand the Ottomans, we need to grasp this European orientation. But also, if we want to understand Europe in this period, we need to understand the Ottomans. Thus far on Tides of History, we've mostly focused on Western Europe. It's time to start broadening our scope a little bit, to reach outwards into the Balkans, Anatolia, the Middle East, and even a bit beyond, to Central Asia. Today, we're going to focus on two distinct strands of this story. The earliest years of the Ottomans, where they came from and how they grew so rapidly, and Holy War in both its Muslim and Christian manifestations. The rise of the Ottomans has to be understood in the context of Gaza, of Holy War. But just as the Ottomans were coming to power largely because of this emphasis on religious warfare, the last gasps of the Crusades, something that had defined the Christian Middle Ages, were playing out. At the end of today's episode, those threads of Gaza, the rise of the Ottomans, and crusading are all going to meet up. So we'll start with the Ottomans. Anatolia, Asia Minor, what's mostly the nation of Turkey now, in the 13th century was a wild and unstable frontier zone. It was the crossroads between different ethnic groups, religious traditions, and political units of all sizes. Long before this, Anatolia had been one of the heartlands of the Roman Empire, and it was the core of the Byzantine state that followed it in the early Middle Ages. Arab armies had made forays into Anatolia throughout the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, but at the midway point of the 11th century, Anatolia was mostly Greek-speaking, it was Christian, and it was ruled by the Byzantines. Over the next 250 years, though, Anatolia changed radically. By the end of the 13th century, Anatolia still had Greek-speaking Christian areas. Some pieces of it were still ruled by the Byzantines. But it was also home to a large Muslim population, most of them Turkic-speaking nomads. These Turkoman pastoralists tended sheep and horses in the high grasslands of Anatolia, moving from pasture to pasture. Petty Turkish warlords, called emirs or begs, ruled a patchwork of small polities. They raided and fought both the Byzantine remnants and each other. So what exactly had caused this shift? First and foremost, there was a massive incoming migration of Turkic speakers, ultimately from Central Asia. This began in the 11th century, and it was cemented by the victories of a Turkic political dynasty, the Seljuks. In 1071, the Seljuks won a crushing victory over the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert. In symbolic terms, this Byzantine defeat opened all of Anatolia to Turkic military incursions and eventually migration. It also incited a series of events that led to the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century. Once they had arrived, the Turks were in Anatolia to stay. Another major wave of Turkic migration joined the Seljuks in the middle of the 13th century. The really brutal and comprehensive conquests of Genghis Khan and the Mongols in East and Central Asia set off a chain reaction. This was long-distance migration, huge movements of substantial numbers of people, most of them Turkic-speaking. These Turks were nomadic pastoralists. The Mongols provided the impetus for them to move a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further still to seek out new pastures. Eventually, they arrived in Anatolia. So this new wave of Turkic speakers, the ones fleeing Genghis Khan, arrived in an Anatolia that was already really splintered and unstable. It crumbled further over the course of the 13th century. So, a variety of Crusader states controlled small patches of territory, most notably Acre to the south in the Levant. The Venetians and the Genoese, the Italian trading cities par excellence, maintained small ports and island bases. The Seljuk Sultanate was still around and it was still powerful, but there were a whole bunch of other, smaller Turkic polities as well. There were powerful neighbors based in Syria and Egypt, the Mamluks. To make matters even more complicated, the Mongols themselves would soon arrive on the doorstep of Anatolia. This new arrival took the form of the Ilkhanids, the Mongol successor state that was centered in Persia. This was a permanent addition to the geopolitical mix. If all of that sounds complicated and confusing, well, it should. That confusion is essential to understanding how and why the Ottomans developed when and where they did. So the Ottomans got their start in northwestern Anatolia, in a region known as Bithynia. It's just to the east of Constantinople on the Asian side. Again, this was a frontier zone. These were the borderlands where the Ilkhanid successors, Turkomans, Byzantines, and the Latins were all competing with each other. There were lots of little statelets here. Some of them were ruled by Greek-speaking elites, others by Turkic-speaking warriors. Some of them were Muslim, some of them were Christian. Some were Orthodox, some were Latin Christian. All of them were temporary and fluid. These were more petty chiefdoms than the seeds of globe-spanning empires. This was a highly competitive political wilderness. There was room for both newcomers and old blood, for both coexistence and conflict. In the words of the historian Cemal Kafadar, whose book Between Two Worlds I'm drawing on really heavily here, the region was characterized by, quote, a high degree of symbiosis, physical mobility, and religious conversions that facilitated the sharing of lore, ideas, institutional practices, and even warriors. So, for example, let's say a new tribe of nominally Muslim Turkic speakers shows up in Anatolia. There was no reason they couldn't fight for a Muslim Seljuk sultan, hire out to an Orthodox Christian Greek despot, or do a turn fighting for the Latin Christian Venetians. Religion mattered here, but maybe not in quite the ways that we would expect. There was, in fact, a long-term struggle going on between members of different religious groups, and these groups did see themselves as representatives of different religious/civilizational entities. But this was not a straightforward conflict between Islam and Christianity. Instead, it was a series of conflicts between different groups that identified as Muslim or Christian, and that was a component of their identities. So, this was the environment that produced the Ottomans, this fluid frontier in-between world of near constant warfare and shifting alliances. It was a world where anything was possible. More specifically, this was the environment that produced Osman, the namesake founder of the Ottoman dynasty. Osman supposedly ruled from 1302 to 1324. He was as shadowy and fluid as the world that produced him. There's not a single written document dating to his reign that we can fully authenticate. What we have instead are semi-plausible legends and outright myths. Osman was supposed to be a descendant of the Kayi tribe. It's possible that his father, Ertugrul, had been in Seljuk service. There's actually a really fun Turkish historical adventure/soap opera on Ertugrul that's on Netflix if you're interested. A famous later legend from the 15th century holds that Osman had a dream or a vision that promised his dynasty wide-ranging power, including the city of Constantinople. What Osman actually did during his life isn't totally clear, but we do know a few things. Osman conducted raids and took booty, especially slaves and precious objects. He formed alliances with his neighbors when it was convenient. Bithynia was right next door to poorly defended Byzantine territory, which made for profitable raids. This was almost certainly a major attraction that allowed Osman to draw lots of talented Turkoman warriors to his banner. When we look at just where Osman was operating, when we look at the place names, it's obvious that he was basically a local warlord. His major victories practically all took place in northwestern Anatolia, in and around Bithynia. In fact, they pretty much all happened within an area that was maybe 150 miles east-west and 100 miles north-south. So basically, Osman was the ruler of a successful but small-scale petty empire in northwestern Anatolia. No major cities fell under its rule. It controlled the countryside from a few fortified places, strongholds to which Osman could retreat when threatened between campaigns. There was no standing army. There were no real centralizing institutions. In essence, what Osman had built was just one of many similar polities dotting the Anatolian landscape. Absolutely nothing about Osman's success was destined to outlive him, much less provide the seed for anything more to follow. But, as luck would have it, Osman's son, Orhan, built on his father's success. He took first the city of Bursa in 1326 and then the larger Nicaea in 1331. These were major urban centers. Nicaea was the second city of the Byzantine Empire after only Constantinople itself. More cities followed, including Nicomedia, now Izmit, and Ankara, a ways to the east. Ankara is now the capital of Turkey. Orhan defeated a large Byzantine army in pitched battle as well. He didn't limit his attention to Christians either. One of Orhan's biggest accomplishments was absorbing the Muslim emirate of Kareshi, which occupied the rest of northwestern Anatolia. This was huge because it gave Orhan and the Ottomans control of the entire coastline of Anatolia where it faced the European side. Just to show you how confusing this world could be, Orhan was deeply involved in the politics of the Byzantine Empire. In fact, he was married to the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor, John VI Kantakouzenos. This marriage bought Ottoman support for John VI faction in a vicious back-and-forth Byzantine civil war. In 1352, John VI's son brought Ottoman troops into Europe for the first time, granting them a fortress on the Gallipoli Peninsula. That's the anecdote that we saw at the very beginning here. In 1354, a couple years after that, the Ottomans took the town of Gallipoli itself. This gave them a secure base in Europe, a base that dominated the approach to Constantinople. The Ottomans were raiders par excellence, and now all of the land around Constantinople on the European side was open to their attacks. Slowly but surely, the Ottomans expanded their territory, both north and south. By 1370, Orhan's successor Murad had extensive territory in both Anatolia and Europe. He built centralized institutions, even a standing army of professional soldiers, the famous Janissaries. There was bureaucracy and taxation. In all of this, the Ottomans were beginning to stand out from the other Turkic emirates of Anatolia, of which there were still many, and not just because they were in Europe as well. There are a few factors that could explain the Ottoman successes. Were their sultans, Osman, Orhan, and now Murad, just smarter and more skilled? Maybe. The Ottomans did have access to poorly defended Byzantine territory, which made for profitable raiding. They also had access to tons of unattached Turkic warriors in Anatolia who were looking for a leader to make them rich. All of that mattered. The Ottomans were unusually flexible in adopting new practices and institutions. This meant that whenever they moved into a new area, they could quickly and easily adapt. Byzantine tax structures suited the Ottomans just fine, so they used them. Ilkhanid and Seljuk bureaucratic organization and a Persian court culture were particularly useful for them, so they took those too. Their standing army, the Janissaries, was based on the old idea, really common throughout the Muslim world, of having a specialized cadre of slave soldiers. Other military institutions had their roots in old Turkic practices. Basically, the Ottomans borrowed from anywhere and everywhere. This made them a little unusual. But there's one other component that deserves some media attention. That's Holy War, Gaza, and the role that it played in all of this Ottoman success. When those wild horsemen poured out of their pasture lands to plunder and take slaves, to seize castles and fight enemy armies in open battle, they weren't just out for loot. There was something deeper happening here. They were answering the centuries-old siren song of war for the faith. You might be familiar with the term jihad for an Islamic holy war. Gaza is not a synonym for it. Jihad has a more defensive and totalizing connotation. Gaza, by contrast, is more vague. It refers more to irregular raiding with the ultimate, kind of ill-defined goal of expanding the power of Islam than all-out war, which is more what jihad means. Practitioners of Gaza are called Ghazis. This whole idea that Gaza played a key role in early Ottoman success is known as the Ghazi thesis. It's currently the most popular explanation in the form put forth by a really excellent historian named Cemal Kafadar. We quoted him earlier, and I'm using his work again here. So, in the most basic form, the Ghazi thesis argues that the attraction of religiously sanctioned war drew Turks westward into Osman's and then his successors' band of warriors. In practical terms, what does that mean? Well, it means that war had a full-on stamp of religious approval. A slave raid into Byzantine territory wasn't just a chance to get rich. It was also in accordance with God's will. Gaza gave the Ottomans access to a large pool of experienced and dangerous warriors. Our literal earliest solid reference to Orhan and his recently deceased father Osman refers to them as Suchauddin and Farhuddin, champion of the faith and glory of the faith, respectively. This was consistent with the general practice among Anatolian Turks at this time. Champion of the faith was a particularly popular title among the begs of Orhan's generation. This Ghazi tradition went back centuries here in the frontier. Oral legends of great Muslim warriors went back to the time of Muhammad and his companions. They had picked up layers, evolved, and shifted languages from Arabic to Turkic over the centuries. This was a massive accretion of different stories and traditions about war for the faith. It was real and it was important because it shaped and molded both leaders like Osman and Orhan and those who chose to follow them. At the core of these shifting, accreting, building up over time Ghazi narratives was a single theme. Services rendered by particular protagonists and their entourages expanded the abode of Islam and/or gained converts. That peace was always there in some form. The details were flexible, though. The poets and the performers who constructed and altered these oral legends were aware of the realities of living in a confused place and time, in a frontier. That sometimes meant cooperating with the Christians. Sometimes it meant playing realpolitik, and even accepting back apostates who had converted to Islam and then reneged. Kafadar sums this up really nicely. Quote, "The literature produced by or among the Ghazis to glorify their deeds did not find it contradictory to portray their Ghazi protagonists in cooperation with Christians." There were some limits to this. So all of this meant the Ottomans were quite happy to fight other Muslims. They don't seem to have had any religious qualms about doing that. The early Ottomans were also pretty tolerant and inclusive as far as Christians and Jews were concerned. The upshot is that there was no constant state of ideologically driven religious warfare. To make matters more complicated than that, early Ottomans, or any of the other Turkic-speaking emirs of Anatolia, were mostly recently arrived tribal nomads. They had only the vaguest idea of what constituted proper Islamic practice, maybe even of what Islam was at all. That's all part of the messiness of real life. An objective standard of knowledge of religious practice doesn't necessarily correlate with self-image. The early Ottomans and their milieu might not have conformed to some highly educated mufti's conception of what Islam was, but that didn't make them un-Muslim. They may have been ignorant of the formal tenets of Islam, but that didn't mean they didn't see themselves as devout. This was the wild frontier. This was a place of rough-hewn holy men and Sufi mystics, of ascetic dervishes with unorthodox ideas about God and religious practice. The legalistic and tightly defined standards of institutionalized Islam just did not exist out here. In this kind of fluid and wild world, self-proclaimed Ghazis could have it all. They could champion their faith, protect their personal honor, and materially gain all at the same time. So in this reading, which seems entirely correct to me, the Ghazi tradition and mindset remained central to the Ottoman project well into the 15th century. The Ottoman dynasts themselves used this imagery and language. It popped up when Mehmet II took Constantinople in 1453. The Ottomans' powerful subordinate lords, these semi-independent warlords who carried out much of the raiding and fighting in the new European borderlands, well, they saw themselves as Ghazis too. So, this was the world that produced the seeds of the Ottoman Empire, this dangerous, unstable frontier wedged in between the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, the Ilkhanids in Persia, the Mamluks in Syria and Egypt, and the Latins, both the Crusaders and the Italian traders. Religious war was the norm here. But Gaza was not the only kind of religious war going on. I've mentioned Crusaders a couple of times now, and you may have an idea in your head of what crusading was. After all, crusading is one of the defining features of the Middle Ages, especially that peak in the high medieval period. When we think of this period as a whole, the image of knights in shining armor traipsing off to the Holy Land to retake Jerusalem is one of the first things that comes to mind. Crusading was a real phenomenon, and it was an important one. For more than 2 centuries, thousands upon thousands of Western European knights really did head hundreds or thousands of miles to fight Muslims in religiously inspired wars. Popes sanctioned preaching campaigns designed to stir up the spirit among the warrior class of Europe. They collected huge amounts of taxes to fund expeditions. Everybody from humble foot soldiers to kings took formal vows, swearing to God and those present that they would not rest until they had retaken Jerusalem. Now, crusading is kind of a confusing topic. Nobody really agrees about what a crusade was or how long the phenomenon lasted. It definitely started in 1095 when Pope Urban II responded to a call for aid from the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Komnenos with a public sermon at Clermont. An organized campaign of recruitment followed. This came in the aftermath of the disastrous Battle of Manzikert, which we talked about a little earlier with the Seljuks. Emperor Alexios was hoping for mercenary troops who would fight under his command and help him out. Instead, he got a huge wave of enthusiasm and a sprawling, out-of-control expedition, the First Crusade. This resulted in several years of absolute bloodbath and a huge swath of territory called the Crusader States in the Near East that ended up under the control of Latin Christian rulers. Basically, the whole area from Edessa in Syria all the way down to Jerusalem ended up being part of these new Crusader states. Over the next couple of centuries, subsequent crusades tried to rescue, reinforce, and expand these little outposts of the Latin West. There was a lot of light and smoke and a very great deal of killing. Some of the most famous kings in Christendom participated, including Richard the Lionheart of England and St. Louis of France. One of the crusades, the fourth in 1204, managed to get just a tiny little bit off track and capture the extremely Christian city of Constantinople. This drove a slow-motion nail into the heart of the Byzantine Empire that took a couple more centuries to fully resolve. Prince Edward of England, the future bad guy in Braveheart, took part in the last major crusade in 1270 to 1271. That one is best known for Edward killing a knife-wielding assassin in his bedroom with his bare hands and his wife sucking poison out of the wound. The port of Acre was the last outpost of the Crusader states in the Holy Land, and it fell to the Mamluks of Egypt in 1291. But what was a crusade, really? In the narrowest sense, a crusade was strictly speaking a holy war with the ultimate goal of retaking Jerusalem. That's it. In the wider sense, though, a crusade was a penitential war. It overlapped with pilgrimage. Jerusalem was a popular destination for crusading, broadly defined, just as it had been a popular pilgrimage destination. In this broader understanding, which seems better to me, crusading could show up not just in the Holy Land, but also in the Baltic, Poland, Spain, Hungary, North Africa, and even within Western Europe itself. There are other questions, too. Did a crusade have to be under papal control? Did it even have to be under the control of clerics? Did kings have to be involved in some capacity? Did participants have to quote-unquote take the cross in a formal vow or ceremony? Or could they just say, yep, you know what, I'm a crusader now? This is a lot to process. There are plenty of people who have spent their entire lives working on this, and they managed to come up with entirely different interpretations. I'm going to give you my take, which you're welcome to disagree with. First, I think the wider definition of crusading is probably closer to the mark in terms of how people actually understood it at the time. It didn't have to be Jerusalem. You could go to Egypt, Spain, the Baltic, and a bunch of other places. Second, the conception of crusading and how it played out in practice was fluid. It changed over time. By the 14th century, the individual initiative of the early crusades, which was based on important but independent nobles, had been replaced by the kings of rising states. Crusades increasingly required taxation and leadership from a leading political figure with the resources of a kingdom to draw on. The papacy falls into this category too, for whatever that's worth. No matter where you stand on these issues, it's clear that crusading was a huge deal in medieval society, politics, culture, and religion. Even for people who never participated in one, crusading shaped their lives. They paid crusade taxes. They heard crusade sermons. Crusading changed concepts of war and religious practice. Now, for example, this is something we talked about a ton back in our episode on chivalry. Crusading had a major influence on how knights perceived violence as a whole. The idea that violence could be religiously justified in some particular cases helped to make violence as a whole morally acceptable to them. If killing in God's name in a formal crusade was not just acceptable but actually good, maybe killing in a conflict that met a legal and theological definition of just war was also good. If killing in a just war was good, maybe killing in any war was good. This was the chain of reasoning that put prowess, a knight's skill at arms, onto a religious and moral pedestal. There was a huge body of tradition that backed this up, including fictional Arthurian legends and true stories of knights in days gone by. Crusading in the 14th century doesn't normally get a lot of attention. Kings weren't putting everything on hold to go gallivanting off to the Holy Land anymore. At this point, the Holy Land was sandwiched in between two exceptionally powerful polities: the Mongol Ilkhanids in the east and the Mamluks of Egypt in the south. Any successful attempt at retaking Jerusalem was going to require long-term diplomatic efforts. You would need tens of thousands of soldiers operating for years at a time and an enormous fleet to transport them. Finally, you were going to need financial resources to support that effort. The Venetians and the Genoese who operated in this region, both politically and commercially, knew all of this. So did the papacy. The kings who would theoretically be leading and funding these efforts figured that all out too. But that doesn't mean that crusading disappeared. In fact, crusading grew ever more integrated into chivalric knightly culture. Fighting against pagans, Saracens, and other unbelievers was a thoroughly praiseworthy activity for any good and chivalrous knight. The irony is that as the Holy Land got further and further out of reach, other opportunities opened up. It's likely that more knights in the second half of the 14th century could legitimately call themselves crusaders than had ever been the case before. There were new theaters closer to home where every well-meaning knight could head out to kill some acceptable enemies for a season or two and stock up on divine favor. It was fashionable. One of the most important of these alternative theaters of crusading was the Eastern Baltic, the last spot in Europe where there were still real, honest-to-goodness pagans left. The Teutonic Knights were a military order like the now defunct Templars or the Hospitallers. Instead of focusing on the Mediterranean or the Holy Land, they had moved their operations to the Baltic to carry the war to those pagans. The Teutonic Knights carved out a full-blown state for themselves along the Baltic coastline. This is called the Ordenstaat. It included pieces of what's now Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. They didn't just fight pagans either. They fought the Grand Duchy of Novgorod, Orthodox, the Kingdom of Poland, Latin Christian, and carried out regular campaigns against the actually pagan Grand Duchy of Lithuania. These regular campaigns were part of a basically political religious conflict, but the Teutonic Knights did a great job of marketing them as a crusade to Western European nobles. Tons of chivalrous young glory seekers went east from England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire to the Baltic to join the Teutonic Knights for a season or two of quote-unquote crusading. These consisted mostly of organized raiding expeditions called Reisen in German. Spain was also a popular destination. The long, ongoing conflict between the Christian powers of Castile and Aragon and their Muslim opponents in the Iberian Peninsula was easy to paint in crusading terms. Periodically, individual actions or campaigns might receive papal sanction as a full-on crusade. Another venue was the Avignon popes' periodic attempts to recover their Italian possessions. What's really notable about this period is just how deep and complex the financial machinery of crusading got. Crusading was expensive, and both kings and the church got more effective at sucking in funds. Now, those funds weren't necessarily destined to be used for crusading. There was more than a little cynicism about this from everybody involved. But, at least in theory, crusade taxes were a common and lucrative thing. So, by the 1380s, the most famous crusades were long over. There were no crusader states left in the Holy Land. But crusading was everywhere. In fact, it was probably more embedded in the culture and practices of chivalry than it had been even at the height of the actual crusading movement in the 13th century. When word went around in 1394 that a crusade to the east, not just a season in Spain or the Baltic, was going to happen, plenty of famous knights jumped at the chance. This crusade would put the flower of Western knighthood on a collision course with the expanding Ottoman Empire. Two very different ideas of holy war were about to collide. As the crusading ideal was rooting itself deeper and deeper into the chivalry of Western European knights, the Ottoman Empire was engaging in an incessant gaza, holy war of its own. The Ottomans, as we talked about, were beginning to stand out from the neighboring Turkic emirates and Anatolia. They were showing characteristics that marked them as different from the rest of the pack. The Ottomans almost met with disaster in the 1360s. On the death of Orhan in 1362, there was a civil war between his three surviving sons, Murad, Ibrahim, and Khalil. Murad had his two brothers executed and emerged victorious. There were other difficulties too, even more serious ones. An expedition from Western Europe led by the Count of Savoy, Amadeo, captured the key fortress and town at Gallipoli in 1366. That was the lifeline on the Dardanelles, the strait that sat between Europe and Asia. Losing it could have cut off the European and Anatolian possessions of the Ottomans from one another. Had the Byzantines been just a little more put together at this time, they could have sliced the growing Ottoman state in two. Despite losing Gallipoli, Murad proved himself to be energetic, ruthless, and capable. He took the important city of Adrianople, northwest of Constantinople in Europe. He made it the new Ottoman capital and renamed it Edirne, the name it still carries today. Capturing Edirne opened up all of Thrace and Bulgaria to Ottoman advances. New routes to the south brought Ottoman raiders and armies into Greece, Albania, and Serbia. At the same time, the Ottomans rolled over their Turkic rivals in Anatolia. Murad met his end on the battlefield of Kosovo in 1389 in the process of winning a Pyrrhic victory over the Serbs. There are competing accounts of his death. One story holds that he was assassinated in the aftermath of the battle by the legendary hero Miloš Obilić. The other, more likely story has Murad killed during the battle by a hit squad of Serbian nobles who managed to break through the Ottoman lines. Either way, this legend became a staple of future Serbian nationalism. It had a long and really influential afterlife, including directly inspiring the assassins of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which incited World War I in 1914. But that is most certainly a story for another time. So, Murad was succeeded by his son Bayezid, who seized the moment after his father's death. Bayezid called his brother Yakub to his battlefield tent in Kosovo and had him strangled. This left Bayezid as the sole surviving heir and Ottoman sultan. The empire that Bayezid stepped into was vigorous and expansionist. It had begun to acquire characteristics and institutions that were, if not unique in themselves, at least a unique blend of different structures that set them apart from both the Christian and the Muslim states around them. Bayezid and his father Murad's reign successfully established two key principles. First, that Ottoman territory was indivisible, and second, that no surviving heir had precedence over the others. It didn't matter whether a son's mother had been a princess or a slave. Each heir would get a shot at the top spot. These were massive departures from the usual practice among Turkic or Mongol-style steppe empires, where each son could inherit a defined chunk of territory. Alternatively, a ruler might designate a favorite son or heir who would be the likely successor. This seems to have been the case with Osman and Orhan just a couple of decades earlier. As far as we can tell, Orhan's brothers had retained some positions of authority within the Ottoman state. That was not the case for Murad's brothers or Bayezid's. Only one could rule. This was a principle called unigeniture, and Ottoman territory would pass undivided from one generation to the next. This, of course, meant that civil war and/or bloody fratricidal assassinations were the order of the day. Nobody liked this. Later on, plenty of sources survive lamenting the regular round of bloodletting. But at the same time, there was a widespread belief that the outcome reflected the will of God, so it was at least tolerated. This unique inheritance and dynastic structure was one thing that set the Ottomans apart. Another was the increasing importance of centralizing institutions, especially the ruler's household. Now, household here doesn't mean the people who lived in the ruler's house. Instead, it's the collection of subordinates that gathered around the person of the ruler. It could extend really far outwards. In the case of the Ottomans, these household subordinates were almost entirely slaves. This didn't mean they were necessarily of low status. Depending on the role they filled, they could be exceptionally important people. Now, it's impossible to overstate what a major role slavery played for the Ottomans. It was the foundation for practically all of the uniquely Ottoman institutions that bound the state as a whole together. The bureaucracy that grew up around the Ottomans came out of this slave-based household. There was a long tradition of bureaucracy, especially from the Persian side of the Islamic world, that the Ottomans drew on heavily. Tax documents, land registers, military service records. Increasingly, the Ottomans were keeping track of all of it. High-ranking slaves administered it. The standing army, including the Janissaries, likewise grew out of this slave-based household. There was a long tradition of slave soldiers in the Muslim world. The Janissaries were a development of this trend. Whether through border raids or a regular levy on Christian subjects called the Devshirme, there was a constant supply of new slaves coming into the Ottoman household. Many of them became Janissaries. They were incredibly loyal and effective on the battlefield. The Janissaries formed the core of an evolving Ottoman military structure, another one of the things that was starting to set them apart from their rivals. The Janissaries were highly disciplined and well-trained infantry, a genuine standing army, the only one in the region. In fact, the Janissaries were the only standing army in Europe for most of the next century. Outside the ruler's growing household, the Ottomans established a network of land grants that they handed over to cavalrymen. These land grants were called timars, and they functioned a lot like fiefs for knights in Western Europe. In return for the use of the land, the timar holder was supposed to show up for military service. This was actually a development of a Byzantine institution called the pronoia, which had functioned basically the same. Essentially, as the Ottomans took over formerly Byzantine territory, a pronoia became a timar, and it provided one or more cavalrymen for service in Muslim armies. In addition to setting up regular structures of military service, both standing with the janissaries and seasonal with the timar holders, the Ottomans also had access to tons of irregular troops. Mounted archers, the kind of light cavalry that had been the mainstay of every Turkic emirate in Anatolia for centuries, akinjis, lightly armored border raiders in the service of the frontier lords, azabs, basically conscripted levies of more or less untrained infantry to serve as cannon fodder, and then finally troops serving under their own lords, who happened to be vassals of the Ottoman ruler. In sum, the Ottomans had developed a much more effective and multifaceted military force than any of the other polities in the region. More important than the kinds of soldiers were the systems behind them. Better bureaucracy and record-keeping meant that the Ottomans knew how many troops they had access to and where they were located. They could organize long, grinding campaigns, which required complex logistics and supply chains. In fact, siege warfare, a demanding and highly technical art, became an Ottoman specialty during exactly this period. These weren't lightly armed nomadic raiders anymore. They took castles and walled cities head-on, to the extent that capturing fortified places was a cornerstone of their strategic approach. What's essential to understand about all this is how different it made the Ottomans than the other Turkoman polities around them. Those might be split into multiple units at the death of a ruler, unlike the Ottoman practice of unigeniture. Those Turkoman polities did not have the slave-based personal households of the Ottoman rulers, at least not on that scale, which meant they didn't have the bureaucratic capabilities or the standing army. By the middle of the 1390s, the Ottomans were pretty clearly well advanced in a process of state building. What came out of this looked much different than what we saw in England and France during the 100 Years' War, but it was definitely a species of state building. Now, at the same time, there were counterbalancing forces. Not everything was pulling in the direction of central control. Ottoman frontier lords who were on the bleeding, cutting edge of the state's advance into Europe and Anatolia weren't thrilled about having an increasingly powerful ruler at the center. At first, Osman had simply been one of them. He was part and parcel of the same Ghazi traditions and norms. Orhan had been powerful, definitely in charge, but still surrounded by relative peers. That had changed with Murad and his centralizing reforms. He was probably the first to use the elevated title of Sultan, as opposed to Emir or Bey or Beg. The frontier lords had military forces of their own, and they were perfectly happy to rebel when they felt their needs weren't being met. This conflict of centralizing tendencies versus powerful frontier lords wouldn't be fully resolved until the middle of the 15th century. So, with all of this in mind, with the victory at Kosovo in 1389 and Bayezid's active early reign, it was obvious that the Ottomans were a force to be reckoned with. The upshot was that the Ottomans controlled the territory from the region south of the Danube River, from Serbia in the north and west, all the way down into northern Greece. Its borders butted up against the powerful Kingdom of Hungary along the Danube and rubbed against the territories of Venice along the Aegean. Ottoman raiders routinely crossed the Danube into Transylvania and Wallachia. The Byzantines had been reduced to vassalage. At the same time, a brief truce had taken hold in the ongoing 100 Years' War. If you think back to our second episode on that topic a few months back, we talked a lot about the Dukes of Burgundy. First, a guy named Philip the Bold, and then his son, John the Fearless, who ended up taking an axe to the head in 1419. Well, in 1394, Philip the Bold was the most powerful nobleman in the French kingdom. He was incredibly rich and ambitious. He was always on the lookout for ways to make himself more important. In the chivalry-mad world of the late 14th century, crusading looked like a pretty solid option. So, that same year, 1394, Philip the Bold sent a delegation led by one of his closest advisors to Hungary to assess the viability of a crusade. At the same time, the King of Hungary, Sigismund, was desperately looking for support from Western Europe. It looked like all of the pieces aligned. In 1395, Philip the Bold's 24-year-old son, John of Nevers, later known as John the Fearless, publicly dedicated his first deed of arms to the service of God. There would be a crusade, and at least nominally, John the Fearless would lead it. So there's a line of argument that treats this crusade as a smart venture, a rational response to Ottoman successes in the Balkans, a way of healing the divide between England and France after decades of war, maybe even a path to ending the Great Schism, which, was also happening at this time. That might have been possible early in the process, but the crusade quickly turned into a one-sided Burgundian showcase. It was an opportunity for Philip to show off his wealth and his authority, his position within the Kingdom of France, and pave the way for an even brighter future for his son and heir John, soon to be the Fearless. It should be clear that seeing the crusade in this light as a bright badge of Burgundian chivalry and power had some clear conflicts with the idea of using it as a practical military force. That was what King Sigismund of Hungary wanted to do. The crusade formed around John of Navarre's household, which amounted to a few hundred knights, squires, and archers. Other great nobles brought their own households. The army came to include a who's who of Burgundian nobility and a nice slice of more generally French high society, including the Constable of France, the highest military official in the kingdom, and a few other major figures. Enguerrand de Coucy, the subject of Barbara Tuchman's great popular history A Distant Mirror, was one of them. There was a smaller but still important German contingent, and a few stragglers showed up from England and Aragon. By late July of 1396, the whole army had assembled, and they set off down the Danube River from Buda, now half of Budapest, toward Ottoman-held territory. It was a fiasco almost from the beginning. French and Burgundian crusaders mistreated the local Orthodox Christian population who happened to be Hungarian vassals. Clerics among them complained, but to no avail. One French priest later said, quote, "They might as well have talked to a deaf ass." It got worse from there as they massacred the Ottoman garrison of a castle they captured, and then both the garrison and the civilians at a fortified town. Their immediate target was the Ottoman-held Danube river port and fortress at Nicopolis, a major strategic point along the Danube corridor in what's now Bulgaria. Bayezid didn't take this lying down. He was besieging Constantinople along with the core of his army. The call went out for troops. Serbian Christian vassal contingents from the Balkans, Ottoman troops from the siege lines around Constantinople, and presumably others. Light cavalry went ahead to scout out the Crusaders and see what was happening. In just weeks, Bayezid's army had assembled at Tarnovo, some 30 miles southeast of Nicopolis. The two armies came into contact on September 24, 1396. There was some raiding back and forth between a detachment of French crusaders and the Ottoman light cavalry. But the core of the battle came the next day, September 25th. The Ottomans were arrayed for battle and took up a defensive position. Their infantry, including the Sultan's janissaries, were in the center at the top of a steep hill, protected by a fence of sharpened stakes. Cavalry lurked on each flank, with Bayezid's professional household cavalry as a reserve behind the front divisions. A screen of light cavalry sat out in front, scouting the Crusaders besieging Nicopolis along the river. The French and Burgundian Crusaders took the lead on the morning of September 25th. They charged through the lightly armed Ottoman cavalry in front and continued up the slope toward the infantry, protected behind their sharpened stakes. Arrows peppered the Crusaders. Quote, "Hail nor rain does not come down in closer shower than did their shafts," wrote one French knight afterward. Horses fell victim to the arrows, but probably few of the Crusader knights, protected by heavy plate and chain armor. Turkish observers were struck by this armor. One later described the Crusaders as, quote, "all covered in blue iron," and another talks about how it shone in the morning sunlight. Some mounted, some on foot, the Crusaders plunged through the defensive barricades and into the Ottoman infantry. Swords and lances flashed. The shouts and screams of men and horses filled the air, melding with the clang of steel on steel and the pounding of hooves and feet on the dry autumn ground. Behind the infantry, further up the hill, a line of Ottoman cavalry dispersed as the Crusaders charged forward. Drums pounded and trumpets blared from the Ottoman lines behind. All was confusion. The sun was now high in the sky, and it beat down on the sweating, tired Crusaders. The French and Burgundians thought they had won the day, but in reality, they were now separated from the rest of the Germans and the Hungarians and their Wallachian allies. In fact, they were about to be surrounded. Bayezid's household cavalry appeared over the lip of the hill the tired, bloodied Crusaders were struggling to climb. More Ottoman cavalry struck them from the flanks. Still more appeared behind them, cutting them off from the Hungarians and the Germans, who were stuck well down the slope of the hill. The French and Burgundian knights had been completely encircled. They fought hard, but it was obvious there was no way out. Those still left alive, including John the Fearless and many other high-ranking nobles, surrendered. At the same time, or perhaps a little later, the timing is confused in all the sources, the Hungarians and the Germans tried to advance toward the Ottoman fortifications to join the French and Burgundians. They were met by Ottoman infantry and cavalry, probably the same ones who had been involved in the scrap that left the French and Burgundians surrounded. Bayezid's Serbian vassals moved around to the flanks, and soon King Sigismund and the German and the Hungarian crusaders were nearly surrounded themselves. Their Wallachian allies had seen enough and withdrew back down toward the Danube. Still in relatively good order at this point, the Germans and the Hungarians pulled back. King Sigismund and other senior nobles managed to board the crusader ships in the river. The ordinary soldiers weren't as lucky. Many drowned in the Danube, and others were captured before they could escape. It was a catastrophe. Most of the Crusader army was dead or captured, including the most senior leaders of the French and Burgundian contingent. We have no real idea how many casualties there were, but there were probably thousands of dead and at least 1,000 taken prisoner. Unfortunately for the prisoners, Bayezid learned the fate of the Ottoman garrisons the Crusaders had taken earlier in the campaign, the ones who had been massacred. He vowed revenge. The next morning, September 26th, Bayezid ordered all but the highest-ranking captives to be executed. They were bound together with cords, made to kneel, and then beheaded. After a little while, Bayezid had seen enough and stopped the killing. By that point, there were hundreds, maybe thousands, of decapitated corpses lying dead on the field. Huge ransoms eventually bought the freedom of the remaining captives, though not all of them made it back. Enguerrand de Coucy fell ill and died, maybe of wounds suffered during the battle. So did many others. John the Fearless, of course, would go on to have a long and distinguished career before taking that axe to the head 23 years later. King Sigismund of Hungary was eventually elected Holy Roman Emperor and led crusades against the Hussites in Bohemia. But this was a lethal blow to crusading in the East. Understandably, as the stories of Crusader incompetence, Ottoman power, and the fates suffered by the prisoners circulated, enthusiasm for the project waned. There would be no major crusading effort against the Ottomans for nearly 50 more years. Never again would the Knights of France sign themselves over to God and travel to the East. That 300-year-old tradition died at Nicopolis. Bayezid's crushing victory had seen to that. The pile of Crusader heads struck off by the Ottoman executioners marked just how far the Ottomans had risen. Bayezid's great-grandfather Osman had been just one of a collection of frontier emirs, ambitious border raiders fighting for their own advancement and for the sake of Islam. Bayezid, by contrast, was sultan of a growing and dangerous empire with a foot in both Anatolia and Europe. When he returned to besieging Constantinople after the battle, it seemed unquestionable that the beleaguered city would fall. The Ottomans would finish off the Byzantines once and for all and confirm their status as the great power of the region. But history is a tricky thing. There was another growing power lurking just over the horizon, one that would throw a serious wrench into the seemingly inevitable rise of the Ottomans. The warlord Timur Lenk, Tamerlane, was about to show up on the scene. What went down when Timur arrived is what we'll begin with next time on Tides of History. Until then, thanks so much for joining me. Be sure and drop me a line if you'd like to chat about the fall of the Roman Empire or the rise of the modern world. You can find me on Twitter at Patrick_Wyman or on Facebook at Patrick Wyman MMA. You can follow the show at Tides History. Tides of History is written and narrated by me, Patrick Wyman. The sound designer is Jeff Schmidt. The sound engineer is Sergio Enriquez. From Wondery, the executive producer is Hernan Lopez. The producer is Leah Sutherland. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, from Wondery, this has been Tides of History.